بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين. قال الله في كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: وهو الذي أنشأ لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة قليلا ما تشكرون. صدق الله العلي العظيم، وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, I'd like to begin by expressing my joy in being here and joining you once again, and by expressing congratulations to the entire Muslim Ummah on the celebration of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Al-Imam Ja'far bin Muhammad as-Sadiq alayhum as-salam. And I'd like to begin with a story that I heard relayed by a Christian pastor. And this Christian pastor was the pastor of a mega church, if you're familiar with mega churches, where upwards of 10,000 people congregate. And so you can imagine that as a pastor of a mega church, he would see hundreds of people, thousands of people in one day. And so he says that one day, as he was greeting the people, as he was walking amongst the people, he said a man handed him a gift. It was a box. The gift was in a wooden box. And because he didn't know the man, because he didn't recognize the man, he assumed that this was like any other gift. And so when he opened it, he didn't really take a good look, but he assumed that it was a watch. And so he took the gift and he went back to his office. He opened up the drawer, and like sometimes when people gift us with something, he tossed the gift in the drawer and closed the drawer. And he forgot about the gift. He said many months later, he said he went back and he opened that drawer and he found that gift box there. And so he opened it up and he found a beautiful watch. So he was curious as to how much this watch cost. What was the value of this watch? And because someone had given it to him again that he didn't recognize, he assumed that the watch probably didn't have any value. When he looked it up online, when he Googled it, he realized that the watch cost thousands of dollars. It was a very expensive watch. It was a gift that was given to him, but he had not discovered its value because he had never opened up that gift. He had never opened up that box. And had it remained, that box, in the drawer of his desk, unopened, he would have never realized its value. There would be nothing that would push him to discover the value of that gift. And I say that because tonight I want to shed a little bit of light on the topic of the unopened gifts that we all have. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He created us, endowed each and every single one of us with gifts, with certain capacities, with certain intelligences, with certain types of intelligence, with potential. And for the vast majority of human beings, much of those capacities, many of those gifts, much of that potential remains undiscovered. There was a quote that I read, and it said that out of every 10,000 gifted children that are born, and that's every child, about 9,999 of them never really understand what their true gifts are. For whatever reason. Sometimes our gifts are never truly discovered because someone said something to us, implanted a false idea in our mind that we are not gifted, that we don't have the capacity to achieve, that we cannot truly achieve our goals. And among the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has endowed us with upon our birth are the following. He says, وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنْشَأَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. That He has initiated, أَنْشَأَ, He has initiated the following: sam', which is the ability to hear; absar, which is vision, the ability to see; and af'ida, which refers to the power of your heart. And every one of these gifts is unique. And what tells us that we're not using these gifts to our full capacity is the fact that at the end of the verse, God says, قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. Rarely are you thankful. Rarely are you grateful. Because if you're truly thankful and you're truly grateful, you would use that gift to its fullest capacity. It's like if someone gives you a gift. Now sometimes we receive gifts and someone buys us a clothing item and it doesn't fit us. It's not the right fit. I'm not talking about things that don't fit. I'm talking about something that fits. Someone gives you something and it fits you perfectly, but you just don't make use of it. Sometimes you buy a gift for someone and you believe as the giver of the gift, you believe that it has value and you see the value and you understand the value, but the person receiving the gift doesn't necessarily know what the value is. And they may be thankful and they're grateful, but in your mind you're thinking, well, if you're truly grateful and you're truly thankful, you would use the gift. You would wear that clothing item that I gifted you. And so God says that very rarely are you grateful. Very rarely are you thankful. And if you were truly grateful, if you were truly thankful, you would take those gifts that I have endowed you with and you would use them to your fullest capacity. And these are only some of the gifts. Now, I want to share with you something that I read recently, and of course this talk is in no way meant to be completely encompassing or inclusive of all of the gifts, because if we were to think about all of the gifts that God has endowed us with, that He has granted us, you'd never be able to count them. Most of the gifts that God has given us, again, we don't even know about as a human race. We don't even understand what our true potential is. It's so interesting. You look at just the human being, how the human being is born. As babies, we're completely dependent. Think about it. Babies are completely dependent. They can't do anything on their own. They can't feed themselves. They can't clothe themselves. They certainly can't put themselves to sleep. They can amuse themselves and maybe make themselves laugh. But a baby is completely dependent. What happens in that process of a few years where a baby that's completely dependent, completely reliable on other people, completely powerless, completely helpless, becomes such a powerful person, such an unstoppable person? Sometimes you see people and they've made so much trouble and so much mischief, and then you think to yourself, well, one day this person was also an innocent baby, and your mind is confused. You can't reconcile the thought and the imagination between this person one day having been an innocent baby to now being a powerful and mischievous adult, someone who has the capacity to ruin people's lives, someone who has the capacity to ruin and destroy their own life. So what is it that happens in between? Well, what happens in between is that person takes the gifts, some of the gifts that God has endowed him or her with, and misuses them. So I want to talk about a number of gifts. And this comes not from myself. This comes from an author he says there are three very powerful gifts that we need in order to become effective and become great at what we do. He says, number one, the most powerful gift, something that resonates with each and every one of us. And he talks about the three unopened gifts. These are gifts that for most people, they're unopened. It's that gift that remains in the closet. It's that gift that we look at, and because you don't like the wrapper, because you don't like the covering, you're not even going to bother to open and see what's inside. It's the gift that was given to you by the person that you don't really know, so you don't really cherish it. It's the gift that was given to you and you just have too many other gifts or too many other things you perceive in your life as gifts that you've kept yourself mentally and emotionally tied to, that you don't have time to open this gift. It's the gift that sometimes you're waiting to re-gift to other people. We all have that place in our closet or that place in our house where people have given us gifts and you don't open it. You're waiting to give that gift back to someone else. So he says one of those most powerful gifts is the idea of freedom. He says freedom, it's something that resonates within our soul. It's something that resonates within our nafs. What is freedom? Now freedom, I spoke about this, I believe, when I was here in Muharram. If you remember, there's a difference with attaining freedom and being carefree. Freedom does not mean being carefree. Freedom refers to the following. So freedom refers to the space between stimulus and response. What does that mean? Stimulus is anything which pushes you or triggers you towards action or a reaction. So if someone was to poke me with a sharp object, that's a way of them stimulating me to react. What happens if someone pokes you with a sharp object? Well, automatically, in terms of your body and your mind, you're told danger. There's alarms that go off in your mind that say, this is dangerous. I need to pull back. I need to react. Or if someone curses you, if someone verbally abuses you, if someone physically abuses you, that's a stimulus. That's something that stimulates you. After the stimulus comes the response. But the response doesn't come immediately after the stimulus. Even though it may look and feel that it is immediate, there's a small space in between. Within that space lies our ability to choose what our response and our reaction will look like. Now, for some people that were born in homes where there's unconditional love, where they're provided for, that space may be a pretty big space. So maybe they won't be bothered as much as a person who maybe grew up in a household where there was not unconditional love. Maybe it was an abusive household. Maybe people said hurtful things. In those cases, you find that people will react negatively to things more quickly. But the freedom that we have is the freedom to choose how to react. The freedom to choose how we will respond to our situations, either positive or negative. But mostly, when it comes to that which is negative. And the reason why it's so important to think about and to talk about that freedom, that space right there, is because we live in a world, if you've noticed, we live in a world where a lot of oppression exists. It's not to say that oppression does not exist, but there is also a victim mentality. There are also campaigns that are out there which tell you that no matter where you're from, you're a victim. If you're a black man, you're a victim. If you're a white man, you're a victim. If you're a Muslim man, you're a victim. If you're a Jewish man, you're a victim. If you're a Christian man, you're a victim. If you're a woman, you're a victim. If you're if you're an immigrant, you're a victim. If you're a non-immigrant and your grandparents have been here for 300 years, you're a victim. There are campaigns out there that are designed to make you feel like a victim. And what happens is, and again, this isn't to say that oppression does not exist, but having an oppression mindset versus a victim mindset is something very different. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi. Assalamu alaikum. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So the victim mindset tells us, once it gets in our head, and once it gets into our conscious, that you can't choose your reactions. What happens to you, it's not your fault. The way that you react, then, is not your fault. But understanding that first gift, the gift of freedom, that you are not created as a robot. God tells us in the Quran that there were creations or creatures that lived before us. Those creatures could not choose what they wanted to do and what they did not want to do. Those creatures were the angels. The angels, they responded to God's commands. They executed God's commands, whether they liked it or they didn't like it. But as a human being, you're not an angel. And you're certainly not a robot. Which means that at every time, at every space, in any situation, you have the ability and you have the freedom and you have the choices to change your reaction. This is number one. And this is a very important gift. You know, what he talks about, this author, he says that once you begin to realize that you have freedom of choice, once you begin to realize that you have freedom of response, he says for some people, it's a very terrifying idea. Because once you understand that you are free to react, and that you have choices, and that what happens in the past does not determine your future, and what people do to you does not determine your behavior. Yes, what people do to us, it influences us. It influences our behavior, but it doesn't determine our behavior. There's a very big difference. If you hang out with the wrong crowd, obviously they're going to influence your choices, but they don't determine your choices. It's you that determines your choices. And that's a very, very important point for all of us to understand. Once you realize that you have freedom, you realize that you are also responsible. And for some people, responsibility is the most terrifying thing that could ever happen to them. Most people who are going down the wrong path don't want responsibility. It's easy to blame somebody else. What he also describes is people that he describes as transition people. What are transition people? Transition people are people who, no matter what has happened to them in their past, no matter what has happened to them in terms of lineage, they have decided that they are going to change their own destiny and the destiny of the people that are to come in their family. And he gives many examples. He says sometimes men come from a lineage of alcoholic fathers. One father who is an alcoholic, who passed the habit on to his son, who passed the habit on to his son, and he passed it on to his son, and 4, 5, 6, 7 generations deep of alcoholism. And then one person, 7 generations below, 8 generations below, 9 generations below, decides to change the destiny of everyone else that is to come after that. That's called a transition person. That's a person who comes to the realization that no matter what has happened in my lineage, no matter what has happened with my father, my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, my past does not take my future hostage. So freedom, freedom to choose, freedom to respond to stimulus, freedom to react in the way that we need to react, freedom to behave. That's one unopened gift many people, they keep in the back of the closet. Why? Because it's easier to blame someone else for our choices. So this is one gift that remains unopened, is our ability to choose what we want to choose, to be free. Another unopened gift is the fact that we have principles that guide our behavior. Now, when we talk about that space between stimulus and response, what is the wisdom? What are the guidelines that guide that behavior in that small space? This comes in the form of another gift, referred to as principles. What are principles? Principles are foundational truths. Principles are rules that serve as a basis for the behavior that gets us what we want out of life. Now, sometimes when we talk about principles, we also talk about values, but there's a difference between values and principles. Values, see, even an evildoer can have values. A band of thieves, they share the same values. When you say the word value, the word value is merit-free. Values are neither good nor bad. Values, however, are images of the principles. So this is how it goes. Our behavior is guided by our values, and our values are rooted in certain principles. When people don't have principles, then their values are not rooted in anything, and if your values are not rooted in anything, then there's no direction and guidance for your behavior. Why it's important to understand what principles you stand by is so that your principles can provide a map for your values, and your values can provide guidance for your behavior. It's like a GPS system. The GPS system, if you remember when GPS systems first came out and they first had them in cars, you had to put a CD. There was a CD that you put in, and anytime the new maps came out, you were sent a new CD. The way that it was able to provide you guidance is because that map that displayed on the screen, it was rooted in something else. It was rooted in something which was established, which was that GPS program. Now, the map is not going to find itself it's not going to find by coincidence. It needs a software that is going to back it up. In that same way, your behaviors that are guided by values, those values need to be rooted in principles. I say that because what the author talks about, who describes this, he describes it as vertigo. Has anyone ever experienced vertigo? Vertigo is when you're in the plane, you're at a high altitude, or you're standing on a high platform and you look down. What happens? What happens when you're standing on a high platform and you look down? You become dizzy. That state of dizziness, it's called vertigo. He says most people, they walk around this world in a state of vertigo. They're dizzy. And the reason they walk around and they're so dizzy is because they have never rooted themselves in principle. And when you don't root yourself in principle and you don't have any values, when you don't stand for anything, then you will fall for everything. And that's why some people, they may get older, they may have some white hairs in their beard and on their head, but you see them 20 years later, they're behaving in the exact same way that they were behaving 20 years earlier. Even though externally things can change. Some people, externally they can change. They can leave one family and create another family. They can sell one car and purchase another car. They can leave one career and go to another career. They can leave one city and go and relocate to another city. They can change these things externally about themselves. But because internally they have not gone through the process of rooting themselves in principle, then nothing really changes. There's a story about a plastic surgeon who lived in the 1940s, and he wrote a book on his experiences. And the book that he wrote had nothing to do with plastic surgery. It was a book on psychology, which makes it very interesting. I mean, why would a plastic surgeon write a book on psychology? Well, the reason he wrote a book on psychology is because he realized that a lot of the people that he was treating and he was doing different procedures for, whether it was a facelift or on the nose or the ears or whatever, he said that some of the people, when he would perform those surgeries, they would come out feeling better about themselves because something was changed physically about them. So they felt better about themselves. He said, but for some people, nothing changed. They didn't feel better about themselves at all. So he began to inquire about those people. He began to ask, okay, well, what is it that didn't change? And he realized that for those people that didn't change, it had nothing to do with their exterior and everything to do with their interior. And he said, it's funny because instead of, they say that it's notorious, and if there are any plastic surgeons here, I don't mean to offend you in any way, but they say that it's a field where they're willing to perform any surgery because there's a lot of money involved, and it's in their benefit to perform that surgery. So if I go in there saying, hey doctor, there's something wrong with my ears, can you pin them back? And there's nothing wrong with them. Well, I mean, he can do it and take the money, but this doctor said no. And what he began to do is he began to tell people, look, people would come in and they would say, doctor, my nose is messed up or my ears are messed up. And he would look at them and he would say, no, there's absolutely nothing wrong with your nose. There's nothing wrong with your ears. And so one of the chapters that he writes in his book is about a spiritual facelift. He said some people, they needed a spiritual facelift. They needed to do a lot of interior work, internal work. And it had nothing to do with external work. I could fix his nose, but it's not going to change anything because he believes certain false assumptions about himself. So going back to that second unopened gift, principles, being rooted in principles. Sometimes people, they never root themselves in anything. They never build their foundation on any principles, and that's why you see in terms of their behavior, they're all over the place. So the first gift is freedom to choose and to behave. The second gift, which remains unopened, are principles and rooting ourselves in principles. The third are what he calls the four intelligences. What is that? So normally when we talk about intelligence, aql, what do we know about the aql? The word that is used to define aql is intelligence. And normally when we talk about intelligence, we think of IQ, which is mental intelligence. There's an IQ test that you can take, and it'll determine how intelligent you are. But studies show that people who have a high IQ and only a high IQ, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be successful in life. In the 1980s, there was a gentleman by the name of Howard Gardner, and he worked at the Harvard School of Education. And he came up with the theory of multiple intelligences, that it's not just mental intelligence, but there's social intelligence, there's emotional intelligence, there is interpersonal intelligence. And so we should not just measure intelligence by an IQ number. And then a gentleman by the name of Daniel Goleman came and he wrote a book, and the book is called Emotional Intelligence, and there's another book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0, and that's become the hot topic nowadays in the professional world. And they talk about how companies and corporations, they hire not just based on a person's IQ, but also based on a person's EQ, which is their emotional intelligence, which refers to their social competency. How do they get along with people? Can they connect with people? Can they lead people? Can they make people feel good about themselves? Do they have empathy? What is empathy? Empathy is when you can sense other people's emotions. Do they have self-awareness? Meaning that, are they aware of their own emotions? Most people, they have no sense of self-awareness. They live for 40 years, 50 years, and it's the same things that trigger them over and over again. It's the same things that make them upset and angry over and over again, but they haven't identified what those things actually are. So part of emotional intelligence is to be aware of your own emotions. What is it that makes me happy? What makes me sad? What makes me feel fulfilled? What makes me feel that I'm living a life of purpose and meaning? So those are two types of intelligence, and this falls under that third gift. So one is mental intelligence, which is IQ. One is emotional intelligence, which is EQ. One is physical intelligence. Our bodies, the physical space that we occupy, are very intelligent. We have roughly, the average human being, roughly about 7 trillion cells in our body, all of them working in unison with one another. You don't have to remind yourself to breathe. Your body automatically breathes. Your breathing mechanism does not shut down when you sleep. Your body is intelligent enough to know that it needs to continue to breathe. You don't need to remind your body to secrete certain chemicals after you have consumed food so that your stomach begins to digest the food. It does that on its own. You don't need to tell your body to detect certain illnesses that are there. Your body has a built-in mechanism that does all of that. So we also have physical intelligence. So knowing how to take care of our bodies and respect that intelligence is very important. And then the last type of intelligence that he talks about, and he calls physical intelligence PQ, so you have IQ, EQ, you have PQ, and then he talks about SQ, which is spiritual intelligence. And that's our longing for the divine. That's the part of our soul that wants to be a part of something bigger, that wants to connect to something greater than itself, that knows that it's not only about our own nafs, our own soul, our own ego, that there's something bigger in this universe. There's a great book written about this subject, and I may have brought it up before, and the book is called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a psychotherapist, and he was a survivor of the Holocaust during World War II. And when he came out, he wrote this book, and he wrote it within about 10 days. He wrote this book, Man's Search for Meaning. It's one of the most powerful pieces of literature out there. It's sold more than 15 million copies around the world. And he talks about how what kept people going based on his observances is the search for meaning, is the search for purpose. Is that some of the people that he observed had given up on their search of meaning and their search of purpose. Those are the ones that eventually, because spiritually they had given up, emotionally and mentally and physically, they were forced to give up. But it began with spiritually giving up. So all of those different intelligences and capacities, they're also related to one another. Our physical intelligence, our emotional intelligence, our mental intelligence, and our spiritual intelligence, they're all related to one another. They're not completely dependent on one another. And so those are 4 capabilities that also represent one unopened gift. And the whole philosophy behind that is that if we don't understand that these are some of the gifts that God has endowed us with. Number 1, I'll repeat again, is the first unopened gift is our freedom to choose our responses and the way that we react to certain situations. Number 2 is principles and the fact that we can root our behavior in principles. And number 3 are those 4 intelligences. If you don't use those gifts, it becomes like that gift that someone gives you that you hide in the back of the closet. It's there, but it's never opened. It's there, but you never realize the value of that gift. And sometimes, when it comes to these gifts, we tend to re-gift. How many of us are guilty of re-gifting? There's a place in your closet, there's a place in your home that's specific for re-gifts. It's the gift that someone gives you that you don't really, it's usually the same thing. It's either a toaster oven or it's something in the home that you don't have immediate use for. And you think, well, instead of opening this, I know that I'm going to have to give a gift to someone, so why don't I just put it somewhere where I can later on give it to someone else? Really, the most embarrassing thing is when you re-gift to the person that actually gave you the gift. You never want to be in that awkward situation. But sometimes People use our gifts more than we use them. What does that mean? They control, and it's an oxymoron, but it's as if they control our freedom. We have given our freedom to other people so that they use it as their own gift. We have rooted our behaviors not in our own principles, but in somebody else's values that maybe are not our own values. We have not expressed our emotional intelligence so that we've become victim to other people's wants and other people's emotions. We have not expressed and found the gift of spiritual intelligence, and so spiritually we're always bothering. Physically, sometimes we don't respect ourselves. We engage in certain behaviors that are physically destructive, and so people don't respect our bodies either. Physically, they don't respect us either. Sometimes, intellectually, we don't respect ourselves. So people don't give our intellect the value that they should give. So when you protect your gifts, when you cherish your gifts, when you honor your gifts, nobody can take them away from you. But if your gifts are out there and you don't realize the value of them, then how do we expect anybody else to realize the value of our gifts? See, when we read about the Prophet, when we read about Al-Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam, when we study their words, there's a lot of technical stuff in there, how to do this, how not to do that, what to refrain from. But if you look at the overarching message of what they had to say, it really boiled down to one thing, and that's knowing your value, knowing who you are, knowing what God has endowed you with, knowing the intelligences and the capacities and the gifts that God has endowed you with, and that you're unique. Nobody can take away the presence. Nobody can take away the gifts that God has given you. Those are your gifts. It's what makes you unique. It's what makes you special. The freedom that you have to choose. That's what makes you special. That's what makes you outstanding. The fact that you're rooted in character and principle, that makes you outstanding. It makes you special. That's what makes other people be a part of your life and contribute. The fact that you respect your own time and you respect yourself, that's what makes you stand out. That's what makes you a leader. That's what makes people want to follow you and be part of your life. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to understand the capacity of our gifts. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep granting us the gifts. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to use our gifts to their fullest capacity in servitude to Him. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to use our gifts in the capacity of serving humanity. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma aghfir lil mu'minina wal mu'minat.